Welcome to Books That Shaped America and our discussion today for All American Weekend. I'm Nancy Davenport, the University Librarian. I'm delighted to see all of you here today. We'd like to do sort of a little population count. So how many of you are here as alums? We're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 of you. How many of you are here as parents? Oh, big crowd, terrific. And how many of you are here as students of those parents? This was fun. You brought your mom to class? This series started several years ago at the Library of Congress. My colleagues there put together a list of 88 books through lots of debate and lots of discussion of books that shaped America. Not because they were prize winners, not because they were some of the best books ever written, but because they caused a lot of conversations, sometimes arguments. So it ranges from books like Dr. Spock, and several of us were sort of raised by parents who read Dr. Spock and thought that was the Bible of raising a kid. They also include books like Goodnight Moon that you read to your children, and books like we're hearing today. So today's discussion is of Beloved, which is kind of a tough book. It's not an easy book to read, it's not an easy book to think about, but it's a powerful book, and it's one that we need to know about. So making his second appearance discussing this book with us, because he did it last winter as well, for a community discussion, is Professor Keith Leonard, who's with the Department of Literature and is an advisor to the Multi-Ethnic Studies minor. He's the author of Fettered Genius, an African-American bardic poet from slavery to civil rights. He received his master's degree at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his PhD was earned at Stanford University. His publications, presentations, courses have revolved around the study of political consciousness in African-American poetry and poetics, and in hip-hop culture. His current interests include African-American artists in Paris, jazz and the African-American culture, and the conception of love, sexuality, and family as political ideals expressed by Black writers. Would you come to the podium, sir? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And I hope that we can make this into a kind of conversation. Beloved is one of my favorite books. Actually, between Beloved and Frankenstein, when people ask me what my favorite books are, I say either Beloved or Frankenstein. It is a book that has moved me greatly, and talk about it in many contexts, in many classes, and I love to learn as much from you as I might be able to share with you. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start at the end, because the end is what motivated me to think about memory in the novel. Plus, we would just love to hear Morrison's language. There is a loneliness that can be rocked. Arms crossed, knees drawn up, holding on. This motion, unlike a ship's, smooths and contains the rocker. It's an inside kind, wrapped tight like skin. Then there's a loneliness that roams. No rocking can hold it down. It is alive, on its own. A dry and spreading thing that makes the sound of one's own feet going seem to come from a far-off place. Everybody knew what she was called, but nobody anywhere knew her name. Disremembered and unaccounted for, she cannot be lost because no one is looking for her. And even if they were, how can they call her if they don't know her name? Although she has claim, she is not claimed. In the place where the long grass opens, the girl who waited to be loved and cries shame erupts into her separate parts to make it easy for the chewing laughter to swallow her all away. It was not a story to pass on. They forgot her like a bad dream. After they made up their tales, shaped and decorated them, those that saw her that day on the porch quickly and deliberately forgot her. It took longer for those who had spoken to her, lived with her, fallen in love with her, to forget, until they realized they couldn't remember, or repeat a single thing she had said, and began to believe that other than what they themselves were thinking, she hadn't said anything at all. So, in the end, they forgot her too. Remembering seemed unwise. They never knew where or why she crouched, or whose was the underwater face she needed like that. Where the memory of the smile under her chin might have been and was not, a latch latched, and lichen attached its apple-green bloom to the metal. What made her think her fingernails could open locks, the rain rained on. It was not a story to pass on. So they forgot her, like an unpleasant dream during a troubling sleep. Occasionally, however, the rustle of a skirt hushes when they wake, and the knuckles brushing a cheek in sleep seem to belong to the sleeper. Sometimes the photograph of a close friend or relative, looked at too long, shifts, and something more familiar than the dear face itself moves there. They can touch it if they like, but they don't, because they know things will never be the same if they do. This is not a story to pass on. Down by the stream in back of 124, her footprints come and go, come and go. They are so familiar. Should a child, an adult, place his feet in them, they will fit. Take them out and they disappear again as though nobody walked there. By and by all trace is gone, and what is forgotten is not only footprints, but the water too, and what is down there. The rest is weather. Not the breath of the disremembered and unaccounted for, but wind in the eaves or spring ice thawing too quickly. Just weather. Certainly no clamor for a kiss, beloved. What's powerful to me about that is the repetition of it is not a story to pass on. It was not a story to pass on. On the one hand, obviously enough, who wants to tell the story of a ghost come back to life causing all kinds of evil? Who wants to tell the story attached to that of the slavery that she represented, of the violence and dismemberment and destruction of personhood that slavery encompassed? But on the other hand, it was not a story to pass on. She was clamoring for a kiss. She wants to be remembered and, instead of being dismembered, put back together again. And there's some sense that throughout the novel, and we'll talk about specific examples in a moment, there's some sense that throughout the novel, putting her back together again might mean putting oneself back together again. Whenever I think about the stories that shouldn't be passed on but need to be passed on, I think about my grandfather. And if people are willing, I hope you will be willing to share a story or two like this. But I think about my grandfather, my mother's father. His name was Ed Smith. He was born and raised in South Georgia. And sometime in the 1920s, his family said to him that you are not being respectful enough to those white folks, so you need to move or else they're going to lynch you. And so he moved and ended up in Twinsburg, Ohio, was raised 9 children there. My mom was the 9th of his 9 children. At some point in those years between 1920s and, say, 1969 when I was born, he decided that Jesus was black, and therefore he could be faithful to the church. And these stories, to me, are connected to one another because there's something about pride and about self-assertion, and about not being beaten down by an unjust system. There's something about what it means to be a Leonard, descended from those Smiths, that is very valuable to me in telling that story. But I can't tell you more than that. I know that Ed Smith, my mother's grandfather, was the youngest of 12 children. I know that his parents, I remember their name. I know their names, so I can't remember now. We have a T-shirt from a family reunion. So I know that they were having children and probably were born just after slavery ended. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know why my grandfather decided at some point in his life, late in his life, that Jesus was black and he could worship. I just know that those stories have been central to what gets passed on every now and then at a family reunion. But why don't I know anymore? Why don't we tell more of the story of why Ed Smith left Georgia? Did someone else in the family get lynched? Had he had one bad encounter? Had he been put in jail at some point? I don't know the answers to these stories. My dad, on the other hand, was an only child and was raised by his aunt and uncle. He was born in Alabama, raised by his aunt and uncle in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and then in Pittsburgh. His mother, who was very much alive, got married and moved to Twinsburg, Ohio. And so my father lived with his aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania, and in the summers he would stay with his mother, my grandmother, and that's how he met my mother, and the rest, as they say, is history. But I have no idea why my grandmother didn't raise my father. And I think he knows, but he doesn't say. And there has been an estrangement in the family between us and her until the day that she died, which was the week before the Thanksgiving, where she invited us all finally to her house. There seemed to be a reconciliation in the offing. But I know no more about the story than that. What kinds of stories are these? Why do we tell parts but not the whole? What does it mean for this forgetting to happen? Does anyone want to share a story like that?
My grandfather was my mother's father, was born in, I think, 1896. And it's very interesting, like your story, he never said much about, and this was, I'm sorry, in rural South Carolina, Orangeburg, St. Matthews area. And he just never said much about the story, and some of it was the story of his life and the difficulty of being a dark-skinned black man in the South, having a farm with 100 acres, raising cotton, but there was a lot of disrespect. You, specifically for him, he had to move within certain guidelines. And he did not want to tell his children those stories. And as a result, my mother cannot fill in a lot of the gaps of his life and other older family members on her side, because he just didn't think it was worth going over. In the late 70s, one of my cousins was, she attended Claflin College in Orangeburg, and she interviewed him and my paternal grandfather, my dad's father, and she got the stories. And it was very interesting because she became the person who had the stories, whereas nobody else could get those stories out of my grandfather, but he recognized that she was essentially the first person in the family going to college, and that he would share that. So it was very interesting.
Thank you for sharing. The little bit that I do have, I wish I had more of that story. I remember when I was in high school, I was told to do a family tree, and I got a couple of stories like that. But the stories that I do have do invest me with a sense of pride. But it also reminds me of what we don't know. As I said, my great-grandparents were in Georgia. Beyond that, I know nothing. One of my colleagues, a scholar named Michelle Wright, calls people like me, who are descendants of slaves, and people like you, who are descendants of Africans who were slaves in the southern United States, she calls us Middle Passage blacks. Our being, our understanding of ourselves, our cultural heritage is defined by a big absence 200 years or so back. And beyond that absence, some people can make connections. Alex Haley made some, both historical and fictional, to his past, but most of us can't quite do that. And so we have claims about being descendants from kings and queens of Africa. Some of us wear kente cloth, we do Kwanzaa, but all of these are gestures towards a remembering that cannot fully happen. And that every now and then when I meditate on that absence, I am struck by that absence as being a kind of trauma. And when you think about what the Middle Passage was, imagine this. You're doing whatever it was that you were doing in West Africa, and maybe the warriors in your group lost to some other warriors in your group. You were shackled, taken to a coast, and these funny-looking, funny-smelling people put you in the bottom of a ship and took you way across the Atlantic to places you didn't think existed, so you had no idea what was happening to you. Some of those Africans jumped off the boat. They just jumped off. And there's stories about Africans who fly back to Africa. And Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon is based in part on that myth of Africans who flew back to Africa, some of whom flew back from the Middle Passage ship itself, others who made it to the US coast, took a look around and said, no thank you, and went back. And whatever the reality of that myth, it's clearly based in part upon those who said, I can't do this, and they jumped into the sea. So the Middle Passage is a trauma of a kind. It is not a story to pass on. But what Morrison captures in that ending is the clamoring for a kiss. What does it mean to yearn for, or to have a past yearn for you? What does it mean to have that kind of horror be a kind of kiss or a kind of love, a possibility of love that's waiting for you to wrap your mind around or to wrap your arms around? What does it mean that behind the face of a family member in a photograph is a face more familiar than theirs? Some aspect of your collective self? In any event, this last section of the novel moves me because it's an attempt to imagine what it would be like to embrace that horrific past. When we think about slavery especially, part of what we think about is accountability. And so there's been very little kind of engagement with that accountability. Bill Clinton did that official apology for slavery and so on. And some of you might have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent article about reparations to think through what are the legacies of that slavery. And part of what happens, I think, in discussions of slavery, and certainly was the case in 1987 when Beloved came out, is that they were highly politicized. I remember Randall Robinson was also talking about reparations at the time that Toni Morrison's book came out, and people were talking about things like, well, who gets the money? It's sort of like sort of like what happens with these Native American casinos. If you can prove you're part of the community, you can get a land lease to do a casino. There were some proposals with reparations in that same way. If you could prove your heritage back to someone who was enslaved, you would get X amount of dollars. Others proposed that you take the money and invest them in communities where the descendants of those slaves lived. Morrison doesn't want to have any of that. She has a different sense of what it might mean to remember slavery. And it has to do with getting at the experience of it. What does it mean to have lived that moment? When Toni Morrison talks about her, one of the reasons she wrote the book, she says, is to talk about getting inside the experience, the interior. She said, quote, "The interest is not the fact of slavery, but what happens internally, emotionally, psychologically, when you are in fact enslaved, and what you do to try to transcend that circumstance." And that is really what Margaret Garner reveals. Margaret Garner, as you know, is the historical figure upon whom Beloved is based. So when I read Toni Morrison's Beloved, I read for that internal life. And how does that internal life operate through a kind of memory? And what does that memory do for that internal life? If you've read the novel, you know Setha spends most of the novel suppressing those memories. She doesn't want her daughter to have any encounter with those memories. But how can we move from a notion of a story not to pass on, something that we should forget, into something more healing, to engage that traumatic history in a way that will heal? It is about a relationship between history and memory in the particular cultural lives of African Americans, but it can be a foundation for considering such issues in U.S. history. I hope we can think through some of the ways in which that traumatic history can be recalled through this novel, through the empowering experience of this one character. I am now the father of a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I cannot imagine what it would take for me to kill them. What would it take for a parent to say, that condition, whatever that condition might be, that condition is worse than my child being alive? I can't picture what that would mean. But to ask that question is Toni Morrison not saying, should we give reparations? It's not Toni Morrison saying, let's make white people feel pain. It is Toni Morrison saying, how do you transcend that? If you find yourself in a position, as Setha did, where school teachers come in to get you, and you said, not that, no, not that, I don't want my children to have that. What must you feel in order to do that to your children? And once you have done so, and all of the consequences that ensue over those next 18 years, how do you live with that? How do you recuperate a sense of your own empowerment from that? So we're not talking here about the $40 million slaves that William C. Rhoden talked about in his book about African-American athletes, or Ben Carson and others talking about African-Americans being slaves to the Democratic plantation. We're not talking about the metaphor of slavery here. We're talking about something beyond political expediency, but about the validation of human life. And let me give a little bit more background. I imagine some of you might know this, but it's worth remembering that when Toni Morrison's Beloved came out in 1987, she was part of a whole host of African-American writers who were writing what came to be called the neo-slave narrative. People like Charles Johnson, who wrote the novel Ox Herding Tale and Middle Passage. Alice Walker's The Color Purple is sometimes read as a kind of slave narrative. Dessa Rose by Shirley Ann Williams, Jubilee by Margaret Walker, and Cora Gadora by Gail Jones are all novels that came out right around the same time, trying to meditate on what it means in the late 1980s and early 1990s for African Americans to reimagine slavery, to get inside the life and mind and society of those African Americans who endured that horrific situation. Part of it was a legacy of the civil rights movement. There had been legislative gains, but the cultural traumas continued and the cultural separations continued. How do we use slavery as an engagement with that history in order to rethink what it might mean for people genuinely to be free now? And part of being free would not just be being able to vote. Part of being free would not only be being able to come to American University as a professor and stand in front of you all and be very happy to do so, but it would also mean to be able to move freely down the street. One of my Facebook feeds recently was about a young man in South Carolina, I believe, who was running. He went for a run at night, and the police stopped him. It was Alabama, because Alabama has a law in place where the police have a very low standard by which they can stop you. So they were doing what was officially a legal stop, but the man was jogging and stopped to catch his breath, and the police stopped him. And he recorded it on a cell phone video. How do we understand that in relationship to the trauma of slavery, in relationship to the legislative gains of the civil rights movement? How do we imagine what a truly free society would look like for people who were descended from those who were enslaved? You add to that the institution of black studies, the whole idea that African American scholars and intellectuals and artists were very deeply understanding this history, that it was no longer something that was inconsequential to American history, that there was a whole center of study about this history, this fuller representation of African American life. And one other component you should know is that there were theorists of slavery who, in the interest of defending the lives and rights of African Americans, imagined slavery to be entirely deadening. It's the Stanley Elkins thesis, it's called. The idea that slavery was so dehumanizing that all of the slaves were Sambos. They were all, like those figures we saw in the Josephine Baker video. They were all these characters who became caricatures of themselves because they had no full human life. And Elkins was saying that is the horror of slavery. By contrast, Eugene Genovese and, of course, later John Blassingame talked about, actually, no, there was a real cultural life among slaves. They managed to have that life survive. So what is it like, what does it mean for a 1980s writer like Toni Morrison to tap into that, to be part of this reconsideration of slavery and understanding what an American national history might mean? And that powerful moment, I think, is part of why we can talk about Beloved as a book that shaped America. It wasn't just about Toni Morrison making her way towards being the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize. This book became part of that real conversation about how to think about this past for our present from the inside rather than from the outside, as a lived experience to the extent that we can recall it in that absence of the Middle Passage, not as political expediency. And it is in this context that it seems to me worth noting, hopefully without getting too deep into the weeds unless you want me to, about the formal choices of the slave, of the writing the slave narrative this way. Why did she write the novel that made it such a difficult read for so many people, aside from the fact that it's being about slavery? If you read the original slave narratives, they're mostly straightforward. They start, I was born. Frederick Douglass is the classic example. I was born. I didn't know my mother very well. I think that I didn't know my mother very well because slaveholders didn't want us to know our mothers very well. Then I saw my aunt getting beaten, and then I realized I was a slave. And then the rest of the story is about how horrible his life is as a slave and leads to his attempt at freedom. So it's a very straightforward narrative line in most of those narrations, especially the ones written by themselves, but even the ones that are dictated to journalists and anthropologists are recorded as a kind of straight narrative line. Many of the slave narratives that, the neo-slave narratives published at the same time as Morrison's Beloved, similarly followed a fairly straightforward narrative line. Morrison doesn't do that, though. And I think it's because she wants to capture this notion of memory. She wants to have us experience both the suppressed memory and the fact that it will refuse to be so suppressed. You have those moments of, one of my favorite images of this is at the end of the first section of the book. You will recall Stampede has just told Paul D what has happened. Paul D went to ask Thessa, was that really you in the newspaper? And she's walking around him in circles like this. And she's talking and walking around in circles and talking and walking around in circles and saying to herself, I'm just going around in circles, I can't get to the point. And that is part of what Morrison captures with the whole book, it seems to me, is that in order to get at this, we can't get at this trauma directly. We have to go around and around because we don't know enough and because of the emotional fear of getting too close to that trauma. It is also the case that going around and around and around is dancing around questions of accountability and shame. As much as Sethe asserts her pride for having done what she did, I protected my children, I saved them, I didn't allow them to be so destroyed, as much as she's proud of that, she must also deal with accountability. How does Paul D put it? You've got 2 feet, not 4. You're a human being. Surely you've come out with a better solution than that. Only animals do that horrible thing to their children. What greater insult could he have offered her fellow slave on the same plantation, knowing the same things she knew? He said, you are animalistic. Really? How could you do that? So running around and around that accountability. The other thing that we should think about in terms of this narrative strategy is that the past keeps erupting. As I said before, Paul D has the tobacco tin in his heart. It gets opened up when he has sexual sex with beloved in that keeping house or the shed or whatever it was. And in that moment, he begins to relive and then to heal from his being arrested and put away in Alfred, Georgia. By the way, my favorite part of the novel, even more than the end, is the passage where he escapes from the Alfred, Georgia. It rained, she says. And that magic moment where he's able to escape, but that's a sidebar. So we try to, in this sort of revolving, simultaneous, repressed and yet irrepressible version of traumatic history, we have this story, this narrative line that goes back and forth and around and around. And part of what it's capturing for us is that this memory is shared. You might recall that when Paul D. first arrives, she says, maybe I can share it with him. Maybe I can talk to him. He was there. And Paul D. Offers her this metaphor. You go ahead deep into those memories. I'll hold your ankles and pull you out when that needs to happen. And he can do that, and she can do that for one another because their memories are shared. And that shared memory means that it's not one narrative line. It's not one story. It is a number of stories being woven together and overlapping with one another. And that novel, therefore, is trying to capture how that memory might work. One of the passages in the novel that has elicited some of the greatest scholarly debate and conversation is when Morrison describes rememory. And I sort of want to turn to that page and talk a little bit about that as a way of getting at this complex mode of memory. If you have this version of the book, it's on page 43 if you want to follow with me. This is Setha telling Denver about the nature of memory. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do, but it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays. And not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around outside my head. I mean, even if I didn't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Asked Denver. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Someday you'd be walking down the road and you hear something or see something going on so clear. And you think it's you thinking it up, a thought picture. But no, it's when you bump into a memory that belongs to somebody else. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. Even if the whole farm, every tree and blade of grass of it dies, the picture is still there. And what's more, if you go there, you who never was there, if you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you. So Denver, you can't never go there. Never. Because even though it's all over you, over and done with, it's going to always be there waiting for you. That's how come I had to get out all my children, no matter what. This idea of rememory has been talked about a lot in scholarship, the idea that memory has a life outside the minds of people. And when I read that passage, sometimes I think it's Setha being overwhelmed by her own response to trauma. She says, it's my rememory. But no, it's actually out there in the world. It's her trying to navigate her own desire to suppress that past and keep her daughter from it. But the idea that that past is still out there, I think is something Morrison wants us to take seriously. And I know that the scholars who read the novel take it very seriously. The idea that memory has a life outside us. It has a physical presence, a ghostly presence. And so when people talk about, there have been scholars who propose that Beloved is not a ghost, but a real person, a lost slave girl who made her way to 124 because 124 used to be a way station. And when Paul D. and Setha take her in, they're taking in yet another horrified, beaten, battered, scarred, destroyed former slave. But it seems at least as reasonable, and I think to betray my perspective, more reasonable to believe it's actually the ghost of their past. It is that collective past. It is that notion of rememory, embodied past, coming out to take care of its vengeance on you or to clamor for that kiss that you never gave it. And when people in the novel debate that problem, one of the things that you might remember is that Ella, who talks about the worst thing, do you remember that? Ella, who was held by a white father and son in a closet and used to do their will on her. Ella, who's a leader of this community and is so scornful of Beloved, of Setha and of baby Suggs for having that a little bit too much. Ella recognizes what it might mean to do such a thing to your children, because Ella, who experienced the worst yet, didn't love those children that she got from the white man and his father. She let those children die. So she knows, and she says, no one wants that kind of evil coming back to life. We don't want that past embodied coming to wreak its vengeance against us. And yet, rememory seems to be something that could be potentially healing. What Setha needs, arguably, is actually to go into that memory, to go for that pain, and to be able to be brought back up by her ankles by Paul D. What do I mean by that? This is one way that you might read the novel. Setha thinks of herself, with all due respect to mothers, thinks of herself too much as a mother. What are some of the things that she says over and over again throughout the novel? I have to get my milk to my children. I have to get my milk to my children. That's why she leaves Sweet Home, even though the plan for escape has been destroyed. She talks about getting my milk to my children. She says over and over again that her children are her best thing. And part of what, and even before that, what was the greatest trauma of being at Sweet Home? That those white boys held her down and took her milk. That was the greatest trauma of Sweet Home. And so that sense of herself as only being a mother, and I say that advisedly, as I said, I'm a father now, and never would say only being a mother. But the idea that one of the things that slavery deprived slaves of was the idea of being in control of your family, of being connected with your family. And so being able to have that, and have that being ripped from you, is so traumatizing to Setha that she thinks of herself primarily or only as that. And so right at the very end of the novel, Paul D says to her, no, Setha, you're your best thing. And she says, me? Me? So imagine this idea, that the trauma of slavery is such that it reduces one's personhood to a kind of function. Mothering to Setha is not raising and loving and caring. Motherhood to Setha is getting my milk to my children. Motherhood to Setha is the basic biological function, if you want to read it that way, such that the success of school teacher and other aspects of slavery is to reduce her personhood to that. All of that is to say that when we read the novel and think about it as a story that is not one to pass on, it is a kind of caution that Morrison is giving us. It is with that caution that she has Paul D return. It is with that caution that once Denver is able to invest a little bit, at least, in that past, she can step off the porch. It is the trauma of that suppressed past, shall we say, that caused the jealousy and spite that prevented the community from saving Setha and her family from the arrival of school teacher. It is therefore that same sense of regaining that past, recapturing that trauma and living it through or reliving it that allowed Ella and her women friends to come and sing the song and to prevent Setha from doing one more murder. And Setha made the right choice, one could say, at the end. Instead of killing her children, she goes after the white man coming into her yard. And those women are there to protect her. She made the right choice in directing her violence outward, but she had a community to prevent her from taking that violence too far. And so there's something about returning to that trauma, the traumatic collective story that is at play in the novel. So let me end with a couple of other thoughts, and then I hope you will feel free to challenge, complicate, wonder aloud about other aspects of the novel. But it seems to me that if you are so absorbed in getting past that past, Morrison seems to be saying, then you are not fully appreciating yourself. And it's kind of I won't go there. There's an aspect of claiming and holding on to and working through the trauma of that past that is an action of valuing yourself. How does Baby Suggs put it when she has that ritual in the clearing? Here, she said, in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just soon pick 'em out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. O my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them. touch others, and so on. Love yourself, and you love yourself with others like you, and by loving yourself with others like you, you work through that trauma. The novel wonders, does this actually work? Because baby Suggs, as you recall, goes and lays down on the bed and studies color, all colors except red, when Setha does what she does, because she could not, and I think this is an exact quotation, either condone nor condemn Setha's rough choice. She understood too well why Setha did what she did, and it challenged her faith that loving ourselves by working through this trauma can be a way to heal ourselves. But it seems to me that Morrison is suggesting that the clamoring for the kiss of that collective past does in fact precisely promise that love of self, that working out of self. And so if we are able to read through Toni Morrison's Beloved and make it to that end where it was not a story to pass on, we should remember to pass the story on, to tell it again and again and again, however uncomfortable it may be, because I think the kiss that we get at the end will be well worth it. Thank you. Questions or comments or observations? Yes. Oh, yes.
When I studied this book in my AP Lit class, or AP Lang, my professor pointed out the repetition of that same phrase at the end, this is not a story to pass on, and that Morrison could have phrased it differently, like, this isn't a story to tell, but that the last two words could have been interpreted differently, like, it's not a story to pass on, like, you have to remember it. So I thought that related really good to what you're saying.
And other implications of pass on about dying. This is not a story to die. The story will keep on living, and it might live whether we tell it or not. Thank you.
There was a novel written several decades ago. Again, I don't remember exactly when. The name of it is Time and Again, and it is about the fictionalization of the Einstein's theory of time and material, and how we are bound in time because of matter, but that there is, in fact, all time exists at the same time. And there are ways you can re-enter the past. And I'm wondering, what you're talking about with Beloved reminds me of that framework as well.
What you say reminds me of a writer named John Edgar Wideman, has said in interviews when he writes his novels, one of which is called Sent for You Yesterday, which is the title borrows from that jazz song, Sent for You Yesterday, Here You Come Today. And that novel similarly about the story of a family heritage told in flashbacks and sort of past and present back and forth, similarly nonlinear like Toni Morrison. He talked about getting his idea from a West African concept of great time, the idea that time is not a line, but more like an ocean, and we are swimming in the ocean, and all aspects of time are present for us. I'm not sure how, one of the things that I find both baffling and inspiring by Toni Morrison is that it's not clear to me, it's clear to me in some of her novels that she takes the spirit world for granted, but it is not as clear to me how much things like that notion of time would be at play for her, because I think she situates human beings and our agency either to choose to be part of or not to be part of such remembering as a kind of a crucial part of this novel. We are, what is at stake at least as much as whether time operates that way is whether or not we manage to understand time operating that way. That is the charge or the accountability that novel holds us to engage with time not as simply a linear thing that we can remember or forget, but as something that we need to embrace more fully as in its full multiplicity. And that multiplicity is at least as much in our minds as it is out in the world. So it's an interesting question to think about how fully engaged Morrison is in kind of the occult, because there's always magical aspects happening in all of her novels. But for me at least, there's so much about human accountability and human agency that she values, that she wants us to actively pursue that. Though if you've read the novel Paradise, you know that at the end there's a window. And two characters get to decide whether or not to go to that window. And that window seems to be genuinely there. So I don't know. But it's interesting to think about how to live with a sensibility of time like that, even if time isn't actually like that. Any other thoughts, questions about specific things that happened in the book?
It helps to have heard you speak about the book, which I found very difficult. It's really an epic, and it's also an opportunity to tell the stories, not only the ones she knew personally, but to gather together stories that she heard. And it was dazzling and overpowering.
The gathering together of stories, the turning of history into kinds of stories that we can read with a different kind of pleasure. It's a really powerful thing that Morrison does, and she talks a lot throughout her interviews and in her own writings about trying to have the voice of her novel be the voice of a storyteller, and that storyteller being not just her, but a kind of collective communal voice. She always specifies it as an African American communal voice, but she says, I write for the African American community, but I imagine that other people will get something out of it, and I hope that they do. So this idea that you have this collective communal voice rooted in a particular culture and history that's gathering those stories and then sharing them with a larger community, and that sense of time and history and accountability that is involved with that is very powerful. So thank you for sharing.
Hi. I just think it's really interesting different ways that we talk about slavery and the different types of slave narratives. I mean, you have like Frederick Douglass, which is sort of straightforward. It's true. Then you have Roots. Some of it's true, some of it's fictional, but it's based in realism, real life. And then you have a lot of fictional narratives, which are sort of magical, some sort of the occult, some sort of the spiritual world entering it, and sort of what's the value of one version over the other. Why do we have this spiritual aspect in it, and how does that help us, I guess, specifically? Yeah.
If people didn't hear, the question was that there are these different versions of slave narratives, some with magic and the occult, and others much more straightforward and historical. And the question is, what is the value of the spiritual? How does that enhance the storytelling? And it's an intriguing question for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a long history, well into the 1970s, that African American writers felt pressured by readers and by themselves always to be realistic. I can't tell you how many fellow student scholars I encountered who said that they read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison or Native Son by Richard Wright for the first time in a history class or a sociology class rather than a literature class. And there was this pressure for the African American writer to be historically accurate and politically accurate, and that pressure was also embraced by some of those writers. They wanted to have their writing serve both the idea of being beautiful but also to be of service to the community, and Morrison says this a lot as well. So part of the turn to the occult, I think, is a relinquishing of that responsibility, or a changing of one's relationship to that responsibility. Instead of having historical accuracy, or in addition to having historical accuracy, instead of having this sense of a mandate that you reflect as accurately as you can what happened then, what you start turning towards, I think, again, as Morrison put it, is this internal life and the sustaining power of that internal life. And if you are turning to that internal life instead of the historical life, what storytelling techniques does that invite or require? If you're going to capture not, here's what Margaret Garner did, and here are some of the consequences of what Margaret Garner did historically, but rather, how could she have done that? What does it feel like to be that? What does it feel like to be her aunt and her friend and her surviving daughter and her two sons who ran away? When you turn to that, then you start getting into the internal lives of a group of people who, in various ways, had various kinds of spirituality with them. and there's lots of scholarship about the transformation of various African practices into Christianity, and how Christianity has changed as a result, so that once you start going into the internal life of these slave communities, as Blasinghame's book called it, you are getting into that spiritual life. And that spiritual life is ultimately more sustaining for that black community. Another way to think about it is, if the audience for a protest novel is the white people who can do something about the power structure, and maybe secondarily, the black people whose consciousness can be changed so they can push for those changes to the power structure, then maybe a primary audience for the spiritual stories is actually the community itself. And this is one of the big shifts that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s. African-American writers actively said, I want my audience to be black people. And when you turn to that audience and you turn to the stories from the inside, I think that spirituality naturally comes. And those stories then become a gathering. And that gathering then becomes less directly about protesting injustice and more fully about remembering and understanding and maybe healing from that past. I think the protest, some would say that I'm downplaying the protest too much, and that might be the case, but I'm really interested. The current book project is actually about how contemporary African-American artists, poets especially, are thinking about this idea of self-determination. A lot of the 1960s radicals, some of whom were Morrison's friends and colleagues, were thought about blackness, the idea that black people had to determine their cultural lives for themselves. And in the 21st century, with what people are calling a post-racial moment, the post-Obama moment, what does it mean for a black community to pursue self-determination? And so one way to do so is to talk about, what does our spiritual life mean to us? And how is our spiritual life an answer to these challenges and traumas of history and their ongoing life in our present? So.
As I understand, one of your major outbringings from the book is the importance of memory and finding the old stories and retaining them and beginning to understand them. I'd like to raise that same issue, but in a different cultural group, and that is right now in our society, we're going through the process of saying, get rid of the Confederate flags and all of the memories for the white community of what you experienced and what happened in the past. I'd like you to reflect on that and say, how should we be dealing with this in the view of what we've been learning from Toni Morrison?
If people didn't hear, the question was about if part of what I'm claiming this novel is about is reclaiming the stories and the past and the value of that, how does that connect with or jibe with the current objections to the Confederate flag and what that means for the communities for whom that flag has great value? That's a complicated question. I should start by being completely frank. I am very skeptical of the Confederate flag as heritage being separate from the Confederate flag as representation of a body of people who wanted to sustain slavery. And because of that skepticism, I might not be the best person to answer that question. That said, to be fair, my family's from the South. I did my master's degree in the South, and I understand a lot of reasons why people in the South would feel committed to a Southern identity. It is a disparaged identity in a lot of television and movies and so on produced in Hollywood and in the Northeast centers of network television. The Southern identity is often the stupid person. Sweet Home Alabama comes to mind. And so you have this idea that the South is this backward, unintelligent, uninhabitable place as compared to the cosmopolitan Northeast or the glitzy Los Angeles. And so I understand that impulse to claim that heritage. And I also understand the ways in which the intensity of certain feelings about certain symbols diminishes over the time, over the generations. When I say civil rights movement, I think about people who gave their lives for something simple like the right to vote. I watched Selma and I wept, even though I knew that the movie was, there's a whole debate about its historical accuracy. I wept because there are people, my father's generation, who said, I'm going to walk from Selma to Montgomery because I don't get the right to vote. And so that's very intense for me. For some of my students in my class, it's like, eh. And I try to persuade them of the intensity of it, but there you have it. So it makes sense to me, therefore, that the Confederate flag as a symbol of the preservation of slavery that part might be lost, and it might be rather for those people, this is our Southern heritage. This is what it means to be Southern. This is our symbol of who we are. We will rise again. We will no longer be put down by the Northern occupation, or however it's phrased in the South. So that impulse makes a great deal of sense to me. I'm not persuaded that the Confederate flag is the best symbol for that, because the Confederacy was, one, a rebellion against the Union of the United States, and two, explicitly for the purpose of preserving slavery. And so, I guess I should add this. I won't add that. That gets into getting a little bit too complicated. But because it was a rebellion dedicated explicitly by the people from Jefferson Davis to the various governors of the states to preserving slavery and, more broadly, the superiority of the white man over the black man, I would wonder aloud to those Southerners, can you find another symbol? What could be another symbol for the South other than the Confederate flag? And I can imagine people saying there isn't one, not as comprehensive, not as all-encompassing as the Confederate flag. And so it's a real debate. I actually feel very comforted in knowing that people are taking those flags down from official state houses and so on. That makes perfect sense to me. But I understand the impulse is the same. I want to remember my heritage. I want to remember my past, and this is a symbol of that past. So I guess maybe I would end my thoughts with this request to those who want to preserve the Confederate flag. Then remember it was a racist symbol. Remember that part too. And then maybe I'll be okay with you flying it on the back of your pickup truck.
But then I would also say that the point of art and memory is that it keeps all of those ideas alive in the pieces of art. So there's no way that anything goes away. I think that's her whole point, is that we're going to keep struggling and dealing with our past because it's always going to be there, so we need to face it. But that doesn't mean we have to fly it in the air. So I think that the art and historians can take care of our culture.
So, and won't surprise you to hear me say, I believe in art. And one of the things that is so powerful about Beloved is that it, as the introduction suggested, it was one of the ones that sparked this conversation. The Confederate flag and its debate about the Confederate flag has raised it in another way. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his elegant article about reparations. Whatever your political perspective about reparations, read that article. The reason you read that article is because, unlike so many of those arguments about reparations, Coates spends less time explaining or trying to figure out how much black people are owed, and more time thinking about how that past still affects us now. And he traces it in part through housing discrimination. He said, and so he tells individual stories of people whose experience of the segregation in the South and the North, which was tied directly to the slavery of the South, suggests that there needs to be some way that we would respond to the ongoing legacy of those practices. It's a kind of like a the statute of limitations on slavery has not yet expired. But when you see great writing like that, when you have these great stories that capture not just the historical component of it, but also that emotional depth of the pain and struggle and trial, and puts it in front of us, and I think in the case of Morrison, inspires us positively to continue confronting, then what greater testimony to memory could there be than a book like Toni Morrison's Beloved? So I want to thank you all for coming and thank the library for hosting this great opportunity. I'm happy to chat with you all over coffee and cookies afterwards, and thank you very much for your time.
Parents, you've had several opportunities today to get a taste of what it's like for your students to be in classrooms. And this was, again, one of them, where it's a powerful discussion about an issue that stays with us. The library is very invested in this conversation in several ways. And we have opportunities for students and community members and anybody who lives within driving distance to continue the conversations with us. We have a series called Exploring Social Justice. And our next speaker, who will be here on October the 29th from 11 until 12:30 is Melvina Ford, who's the executive director of the Equal Rights Center. In today's society, discrimination can often be difficult to identify. It's become more sophisticated, and as laws change, mainstream America can be slow at implementing new standards. We're going to join with her as she talks about how one organization uses civil rights testing to identify and remediate discriminatory practices. The use of testing as a civil rights strategy is critical in generating data for research, for policy, for advocacy, for compliance, and for litigation. So it will be here in the library, and we invite you to come. The next one in our series of Books That Shaped America looks at another African-American author, Zora Neale Hurston, and Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's one of my favorite books of all time. For me, it was a book that I'm a listener as a reader. I drive an hour and a half each way to work every day. I live 11 miles from here, and it takes me an hour and a half to get here. But I found the language so lush, so compelling, so lulling, and so poetic that I had to keep repeating the CD to be able to find the story that was embedded in it. And it's that juxtaposition of the very tough story and the very exquisite, gorgeous language that Toni Morrison chooses that's always been sort of the pivot point for me of how gracious she was to do that. Because that story could have been told so very differently. Thank you all for coming today. Yes, and it's an interesting one. One of the things that happens in this particular conversations about books that shaped America is we frequently have professors stepping out of their scholarly area to take on a book. In this case, you had an absolute scholar in this area. But we're going to have Daniel Whitman, who's an assistant professor of foreign policy, who will be coming in to talk about that book. At this event last year, we had a law professor talking about the legends of Sleepy Hollow. So you don't know what you're going to find when you come back next year, but we do a whole series of book discussions during the course of the year. Some of our community members have been with us for almost all of them, and we like that conversation that brings students, community members, faculty, and anybody who's around the university to come in and discuss a book together. It's part of the reason we all came here. Which one? The next one for Books That Shaped America, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is October the 27th, noon to 1. Okay? Same room as always, the training and events room upstairs. And then Melvina Ford will be here on the 29th from 11 to 12:30. Thank you for coming today. And do stay and talk.